Welcome, friends, to the next section on constructivism. We have already discussed some of the basic premises of constructivism and how constructivism is in some ways similar to neorealism, but in many other ways it is very different from neorealism, and it makes certain very definite claims about its uniqueness, whereby it identifies or rather emphasizes upon the importance of ideas, intersubjective interactions among actors at the international level, and the process of socialization at the international level, which actually leads to the creation of interests or new interests of state actors in the international political arena. When the argument is that although certain patterns in international politics might appear to be stable, but they also change. Therefore, in the international relations arena, we have the possibility of friends turning enemies and vice versa. According to Wendt, it is done in 3 steps. First, when there is an end to consensus around the terms of relationship. Because every relationship in the international political arena between and among actors has certain terms of relationship. So the first step is when the consensus on the terms of relationship is broken. This may happen for many reasons, but the most common is when an actor behaves differently from what it usually does. For example, if you look at international politics today, America has had very close links with its allies on the European continent. But recently we have heard Mr. Donald Trump, who is one of the candidates for the presidential election, saying very openly that we cannot rather carry the burden of Europeans on our shoulders. So it is not our responsibility to underwrite the security of Europe, where Europeans have to fend for themselves. Now, there was a certain consensus, which was the basis of the relationship between America and the European countries who are part of the Western world, And that relationship was very important for both the parties. And whenever any new administration came in America, this relationship only went from being strong to stronger. But here comes someone who is saying, he used to say this when he was president earlier, but now he is very categorical and very firm in what he is asserting. Although a lot of people within his own political party and in many European countries, people have not agreed with him, but nevertheless. Now that is something, which is the beginning of a process of breaking a consensus which was there for a considerable period of time. This unexpected behavior leads to the end of consensus and consequently to the denaturalization of both identities. Now both these actors, America and the West European countries, have naturalized a certain identity vis-a-vis each other. So suppose Trump, hypothetically speaking, Trump comes to power and he ends this consensus. So what will happen? That both these actors, the European countries on one side and America on the other side, have to denaturalize their identities. Because their identities have been naturalized in a certain manner over a period of time since 1945. Now they will have to denaturalize, redefine their identities in relation to each other. And of course, this denaturalization will open the possibility of new identity constructions. Because when you denaturalize one form of identity, you create some new form of identity, it is bound to be constructed. Because every state in international political arena will have a certain identity. So if you break the mold of a previous identity, a new kind of identity is eventually bound to emerge. That is something which is inevitable. So what will usually happen in the final stage? Through alter casting practices. What are these alter casting practices? That is, when one side starts to interact with the other as if the other has already changed its identity. So what happens that even before the other actor has actually changed, materially changed in its actions, this actor A, starts changing as regards his interaction with the other actor. So the point basically is that even before both of them have totally denaturalized their identities vis-a-vis each other, they slowly and gradually start changing to adjust to a new situation, and that adjustment leads them to the creation of new identities in both these actors. So therefore, he argues as a consequence of this process, Alexander Wendt argues that enemies can thus become friends and friends can become enemies. And that you see very frequently happening in the international political arena, that friends who were friends for a long time turn foes and foes turn friends. And that is something, which happens in the international political arena, for which this explanation of Wendt is quite convincing, and it goes at the very heart of the issue, and it tries to understand the rationale and the logic why states, or the behavior of states change vis-a-vis other states with the passage of time and with the change in the social relations or the change in their social interactions or change in the process of socialization, which rather gives them new, fresh identities in the international arena. In short, the relationship between actors in international politics evolve over time as a result of a historical process of interaction. So therefore, this explanation, which we were just now looking at, it very nicely illustrates the constructed dimension of social relations. So social relations do get constructed over time, and they get constructed over time because of the way, that interaction is taking place. So change in the perceptions, in the identities, in the assumptions of one actor at one point of time has logical consequences on other actors who are interacting with this particular actor. So there is some kind of intersubjectivity which is at work in the social relations of countries at the international level. For Wendt, identities, interests, and roles interplay in three different cultures of anarchy, which he calls as Hobbesian, Lockean, and Kantian. He says that in a Hobbesian culture, states are mutually concerned with self-help and survival. And why they are concerned with self-help and survival? Because their assumptions are based on a rather very crude reading of Hobbes, E.H. Carr, and Morgenthau, etc., which places states in a context of constant violence, balance of power, and enmity. So they have certain knowledge, certain understanding. Maybe according to Wendt, that knowledge is not the true knowledge which they should be having after reading these stalwarts of the realist school of thought. But nevertheless, that kind of a reading, places them in a certain context where they think that violence, conflict, and enmity are certain things which are inevitable. Similarly, in the next situation which he illustrates in his work, his Lockean anarchy is very much in line with Heidlebel's anarchical society. In this context, rivalry rather than enmity is the base of interstate relations. So, guided by this kind of a frame, states would be rivals of each other, Why? Because they would be trying to have an edge in terms of relative power. Because they understand that unless they have relative power, means more power than their adversary, their survival in the international arena would be endangered. So despite the fact that they have no enmity, or regardless of the fact whether there is an element of enmity or not, the basic thing is this rivalry which states are enmeshed in, and they are constantly in the pursuit of relative power in international arena. Conflicts and violence are constrained by the mutual recognition of sovereignty. So that is something which happens in this particular frame. Finally, in the last Kantian frame, he says that the Kantian culture states that states would move beyond self-help and embrace a collective security, culture, or architecture. So this Kantian frame, which is not the kind of frame which the Hobbesian frame would give you, here states would be guided by this liberal idea of internationalism, and they would think that collective security frames are more useful for them, more productive for them, and therefore they would move towards embracing that collective security architecture. They would think, or they would start thinking, that living together or living collectively and thinking that the security of one depends on the security of all is something which will secure peace and security for all of them, and that is why they would be willing to come around in this kind of a frame with other countries in the world. So these are the three frames which have been developed by Alexander Wendt to explain to us the complex interaction of identities, interests and roles, and how they interact with each other. As ideal types, these cultures correspond to different stages of state behavior that change according to the evolution of ideas, experiences, and socialization processes. So state behavior, he argues, would change as the ideas would evolve. For example, if you look at the European continent, countries like France and Germany were traditional rivals. They fought so many wars with each other. They were on rival sides even in the World War. And after the World War, when this idea of European coal and steel community came up, many people just rebuffed this idea. How is it possible? How can these countries think on these lines? But as the constructivists would like us to understand that certain new ideas evolved. Countries in a new situation realized that they had to come up to a higher level of ideas, to a different level of a situation, and where they came to understand, and their experience taught them that if they would cooperate with each other, that would be more in their interest as compared to the conflict which was the defining principle of their relationships in the past. And therefore, countries could evolve to a new level of interaction. And slowly and gradually, we see how that idea evolved on the whole European continent, and consequently a large number of countries came to accept those ideas and change their behavior vis-a-vis others, although many of them had fought so many wars with each other. But despite that, they realized that in a new situation, in a new environment, and this new socialization process came up with some new ideas for them. So therefore, what Wendt says is that these cultures, means these frames which he has given to us of cultures, they are actually conceptual tools, and which can be very useful for us to understand how states move from relations of enmity to the fulfillment of international norms and the membership of collective security arrangements. So this is how states may graduate from one kind of a behavior to a different kind of behavior and then to a more diverse kind of behavior with the passage of time. But as we are there in one kind of a behavior, for example, which is based on relations of enmity, generally our understanding is that this is something fixed, we can't move out of it. But as new ideas evolve, we find that a new kind of behavior is something which is in the best interest of that country. So that interaction among countries creates new ideas and gives opportunities for the operationalization of these ideas, of maybe cooperation, of maybe compliance to international norms, or of maybe coming together in some regional or international organization, and then realizing that these ideas are more useful for them. So instead of going back to the original ideas from where they started, they would be slowly and gradually moving forward to new ideas. So as these ideas evolve, as the states would have new experiences, they would be thinking of behaving differently in the international political arena. So that is how things do change as far as behavior of states in international politics is concerned. So Wendt argues that therefore states may sometimes have a normative position on issues like, say, for example, on environment. And they might come up with a survival discourse when it comes to migration. So therefore, there are rather clear-cut examples in the international political arena. For example, if you look, just for example, if you look at a country like Poland, so Poland would have a very normative position on environment. But when it comes to the issue of migration, and especially migration of people coming from the Middle Eastern countries, they would say, no, we need to survive, our culture needs to survive, we have our uniqueness, we have our civilization, we are very peaceful, and we don't want to disturb our order, and therefore there is a firm no to migration which is coming from the Middle East. But the same survival discourse, earlier they were only saying that we don't want migrants in our country, but once the migrants started coming from Ukraine and they took more than 1 million migrants from Ukraine, they started talking about this survival issue, that these people from Ukraine belong to the same civilization, they are all Christians mostly, and they are whites and they are coming to us, they are like us, so their integration in our society will not be dangerous for our survival, which will not fragment our society, and therefore it's fine. But when it comes to migrants coming from the Middle East, they are disruptive, and therefore that survival discourse comes in. So therefore, on one particular issue, states are normative. On the other issue, they could be giving a survival discourse, and then within that survival discourse also you find two strands here, that when it comes to migrants from Ukraine, the discourse is different vis-a-vis migrants, and when it is migrants coming from Syria or other Middle Eastern countries, the survival discourse acquires a different spin. So this is how, states would have different positions, on different issues, and sometimes different positions on the same issue even. So there are so many important scholars like, as I mentioned, Onuf and others and Wendt, but basically Wendt's work is very path-breaking because it helped to consolidate the role of identities in the discipline of international relations by offering a very rich account of how they were formed and reproduced. So this whole explanation about the formation of identities, how identities are formed, how these identities are so very important, and how the states would put all their energies behind the actualization of their interest, which is defined by this particular identity today. And tomorrow, when the identities change, the roles of the countries would also change, and the states would put all their resources in their capacity to actually implement the new interests which are defined by this new acquired identity. So therefore, it is something very interesting, which has come to us through these scholars from this school of constructivism who are trying to give us a very different new explanation to understand how international politics operates. So their emphasis is not on the material factors, although they sometimes would acknowledge that these material factors do exist in the international political arena. Certain structures are there permanently like the states, but why states do what they are doing is determined basically by the ideas, by the identities which states acquire as a consequence of these ideas, and by their intersubjective knowledge which they acquire when they are interacting with other actors in the international political arena, by the consequence of the socialization of state actors in the international political arena, and by the new interests which the states would discover as a consequence of these processes. So this is something which is very significant in the sense that it helps us to understand international politics from a very different, fresh perspective. And that is why the constructivist approach is considered to be something very significant and very important addition to the discourse on international relations. Although there are some scholars who are strongly wedded to the dominant narrative of realism and new realism, they do not, especially in American universities, who do not take this constructivist position so seriously, and they say that the constructivists do not have a research agenda and therefore they are only talking about issues which are abstract, and therefore the researches in the field of constructivism cannot be quantifiably understood because their understandings and their explanations are very much quantitative research driven agendas. But nevertheless, on the other side, there are scholars who take this approach very seriously because it is trying to bring these two different perspectives, quantitative researches on one side and so-called qualitative researches on the other side, and trying to create a bridge and trying to tell us that all knowledge is useful. So therefore, to fight with each other in the field of academics and trying to say that this school is biased in terms of qualitative explanations and the other school is biased in terms of quantitative explanations would not take us anywhere. We can take the theoretical tools and equipments from all schools and use them to our advantage to understand how things happen the way they happen in the international political arena, because finally what is our interest as scholars of international relations is to understand things, understand processes, understand actions of countries in the international political arena, and to see that why states are doing what they are doing. So all these theoretical frameworks which we have understood, the realist, the neo-realist, the liberal, the neoliberal, the constructivist position, the feminist position, the Marxian position, all of these are just tools and instruments which facilitate our understanding. And here we can only say more the better. So the more tools we have, the better understanding we will be able to develop as far as the developments in the international political arena are concerned. Thank you.